Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a modern campaign agency dedicated to using data-driven grassroots organising to build winning campaigns and make the world a better place. Whether you're in business, issue-based campaigns or an organisation driving change in your community, Dunn Street develops strategies to overcome challenges by connecting people that share the same values and organises them to achieve the common goals from the ground up. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Hello and welcome to Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that will dive into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. On this week's episode, I was joined by US communications strategist Ben Labolt. For over a decade, Ben has served as a communications strategist on campaigns at the city, state, and national level on Capitol Hill and in the Obama White House, and was the national press secretary for President Obama's re-election campaign back in 2012. Ben spoke about his time in the White House and working for then Senator Barack Obama and then eventually President Obama, and we got his thoughts on the Democratic primary race at the moment. And we had a longer conversation about what centre, left or social democratic parties must do to ensure success at election time. And his observations were even more relevant following the appalling performance by Jeremy Corbyn and the Labor Party in the UK at last week's general elections in Britain. I will point out this episode actually was recorded a couple of days before the election, but his thoughts are just as relevant then as it is now. And also just a bit of a special thanks to a couple of organisations. This episode is actually recorded in conjunction with both the Chifley Research Centre and Australian Labour International, who did a lot of the work to get Ben out to Australia the other week for the Chifley Research Centre's policy conference in Sydney towards 2022. And it should also mention the Chifley Research Centre is the official policy think tank for the Australian Labor Party, and you can obviously attend any of their events that they organise, but also you can donate. They always need small dollar donations to help do the good work that they do, which is to help develop policy for the Labor Party right across the country. So if you want to, just give them $5 or $10 or maybe $100. I don't know, it's up to you. Jump on the website, just Google Chifley Research Centre and throw them a donation and give them a hand because they do great work. We have one more episode to go before the year finishes up. Next week, we have one of my favourite politicians and a great Labor person, the member for the Eastern Region in the Victorian State Parliament, Harriet Shing, will be joining us to wrap up 2009, so that should be fun. I'm looking forward to doing that, and then we're going to have a little bit of a break before we get back into 2020 and the episodes for another year. The podcast obviously is always available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And remember, if you're on Apple Podcasts, please give us a rating and leave a review. And if you use it or listen to the podcast on whatever podcast app you use, please make sure you subscribe so you get the most recent episodes of Socially Democratic on your listening device. And for updates, make sure you follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to this week's episode. Okay, we're taping this one on a Monday in downtown Melbourne, back in my home state. And on today's episode, we are joined by the former press secretary and White House spokesperson during the Obama administration and now a partner at Bully Pit Interactive, which is a Democratic comms agency. Ben Labolt, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thanks for having me. Great to be in Melbourne.
Is this your first time in Melbourne?
It's my second, and I'm excited to explore it again. I remember the coffee culture and how incredibly vibrant the city was, so hoping to get out there when it's a little bit less warm.
It's a bit stinky hot today.
It is.
The city smells like a really disgusting fart at the moment. It's quite warm. You were in Sydney over the weekend for the Chifley conference towards 2022. Impressions, comparisons between Melbourne and Sydney, and I have to warn you, don't fuck this up, Ben.
I'm sure it's quite a contentious conversation in the country. I think of Sydney. Look, Sydney is absolutely beautiful. I think about it. People never like their cities compared, but for an American, you come into the city and it feels like the city of London dropped into the topography of Los Angeles with the beautiful beaches and people and places. Melbourne, for me, feels a little bit more like New York. It's arts, it's culture, it's interesting architecture. So you kind of need both. And I'm glad that I'm getting to both on this trip.
Very diplomatically put. That's good. You're doing well. You've passed so far. We can continue this interview now. You're out here, obviously, doing a number of presentations and speeches and meeting folks from the social democratic side of politics. And we're going to talk a bit about some of the things you've been talking about over the last couple of days. But before we do, I think it's useful for our listeners to get a bit of a sense of who you are and how you got involved in democratic politics in the United States. So where do you hail from, and what's the story of self for Ben?
Story of self, the origin story. I grew up outside of the city of Chicago, which is sort of a legendary political city in the United States. I grew up while Mayor Daley, the younger one, was mayor for 29 years, and his father was mayor for about that long before him. So they call Chicago the city that works, and politics really mattered. The mayor was on the front page of the paper 4 or 5 times a day for everything from big ideas and big thinking to making sure that your trash got picked up and that the snow got plowed. And so it's sort of in your blood when you grow up around a city like that, although I think it's a lot more small d democratic these days than it was back then. I went to college on the East Coast while in the state of Vermont while Governor Howard Dean was the governor there. He then ran for president in 2004. Sort of an insurgent challenger campaign and barely lost the nomination for president. But I started the old-fashioned way, getting paid to knock on doors, which I'm not sure my parents were overly excited about after paying for my college education. But it was a great experience talking to voters, learning the very tactile art of persuasion and how you win campaigns on the ground, and then spent my formative years doing political communications for President Obama, starting when he was a senator, for members of Congress from the industrial Midwest, which gave me very good perspective on a lot of challenges that now the entire country is facing.
You mentioned Senator Obama, so you've obviously bought stocks in the Obama company early. How did you come across this guy with a unique name?
The Democratic Convention often showcases, when we're nominating our next presidential candidate, an emerging voice within the party. And in 2004, John Kerry selected a state senator from Illinois that not many people had heard of, but who opposed the Iraq War, who wrote an incredibly compelling book about his life story that linked a lot to the sense of identity in the United States. I worked for a member of Congress from Chicago, and so he was on my radar screen earlier than others. But I thought he represented a new type of politics. Some people thought it was a post-partisan vision at the time. That turned out not to be true when the Republican Party, after he was elected, decided that they would try to stop every piece of legislation he tried to pass for 8 years instead of engaging to shape policy. But I knew that he had both the political skills, the pragmatic vision, and the cultural resonance to be a different kind of leader that got new people involved in politics for the first time. And I really wanted to be a part of that.
What were you doing for him at the start when you went into his senatorial office?
So I was the spokesman in his Senate office shortly before he announced that he was running for president. So my job was really to answer the mail for his home state with the press corps to showcase all of the work he was doing in the Senate, from transparency in the government to helping veterans. And deal with a pretty aggressive press corps in Chicago. Our regional press corps are typically the toughest on presidential candidates who are local because they know them so well and also want to feel like they're doing the most investigative work on them. So, I was doing work at that time to really shape his biography for the country through the home state press corps.
Thinking about you working on the Obama campaign as he announces and going through the early stages of the primary campaign, and where we're recording this in early December, we're probably less than a month now from the first caucus in Iowa. If you reflect back to this time in 2007, was there a moment where you thought, okay, we're a reasonably good chance? How did you feel around about mid-December about Obama's chances going to that first primary in Iowa?
Well, by December, we were feeling a lot better about Senator Obama's chances in the Iowa caucuses, and I think the one thing our primary system does is it allows candidates that are not the establishment candidate to kind of hunker down. In the early states, get to know voters, have the voters kick the tires, and decide they might want to take a chance on somebody who's, not the best finance candidate or not the best known candidate. And so while Hillary Clinton had national name ID and support across the country, particularly from the political establishment, our strategy was to get Obama to Iowa and have him spend as much time in those 99 counties, talking to the local press, talking to voters and others. We had a dark period as recently as September, October of that year when he was getting hammered in the national polls and the Iowa numbers hadn't started to pick up enough. But by December, polls started showing that he might be in a position to win the Iowa caucuses, and there were a couple that had him on top. This time around, Iowa's a month later, as is New Hampshire, and we've had multiple frontrunners. We've had Biden on top, we've had Warren on top. Now Mayor Pete of South Bend, Indiana, is on top of the polls in Iowa. So there could be another change by the time we get to February. We'll see.
So is it a bit of is it like, because of the stacked field this time around, it's a bit like comparing apples and oranges? Is it hard for you to sort of think about your experiences back in 2007 and look at the current candidates and say, right, they kind of have the feel that...
I think it was a stacked field back then, too. I mean, we had Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, John Edwards. We had some big names running for office, and it was highly competitive, and we do this time around as well. I think the phenomenon we've seen this time around, that kind of eventually felt like a bipolar contest between Obama and Clinton. This feels like it's multipolar, and the trend that we're experiencing is whoever becomes the front runner for that week or that month then has 12 other candidates attacking them every day, and they tend to get taken down a notch. And so emerging at exactly the right time might be the formula to win this time around.
And timing is everything, which is not something you can control, which is such a frustrating thing from a campaign perspective. It's that you always want to operate on the things that you can control, and things you can't, well, you're just going to have to just let that happen. But that's something you definitely cannot control, is the timing. That's right.
I mean, we create these, beautiful calendars of message events and every announcement we're going to do for the next 6 months. And those are overtaken by events almost every time. I've never wanted that to be my job on the campaign because I know how futile it is.
Well, I was going to ask you a whole bunch of questions about the primaries, but we seem to have slipped into it now. We'll go back to the other stuff a little bit later on. So while we're here, were you surprised? What has surprised you the most thus far in this primary campaign?
It's been very hard to predict. I think it's the hardest one to predict of my lifetime. I entered the race thinking that Senator Kamala Harris of California had a very good shot at being the nominee, as much as anybody else did. And I would have never predicted that she would have run out of money and dropped out of the race by this point in the campaign. You know, I thought she had a unique ability to put together the Obama coalition again. She has been incredibly articulate in the Judiciary Committee hearings, holding Trump nominees accountable, holding his Supreme Court appointees accountable during that process. She had a great and well-planned announcement, but the campaign ended up having 4 or 5 messages and 4 or 5 healthcare plans, and it ended up just feeling a little bit disorganized. And ultimately, that's why campaigns matter and primary nomination processes matter. We need to have a nominee who really has the endurance to make it through the general election, which is going to be very tough.
So who do you think has the endurance to make it through based on what we're seeing right now?
I think that there are 4 candidates who could potentially be the nominee. Those candidates are Warren, Sanders, Mayor Pete, and Joe Biden. I think all of them have shown by keeping their numbers as high as they have at this point in the race that they could have the endurance to make it through the general election. I'm somebody who wants to see generational change within the party. I think that we've tended to elect Democratic presidents when they've been younger, at least in recent history. If you think about JFK, if you think about Obama, if you think about Clinton. And part of it is that cultural resonance I was talking about earlier, how not only do they need a crisp message, but they have to communicate like Americans communicate today and reach them where they receive their information. And that today is, on their mobile phones. It's not necessarily the news networks and some of the traditional forms of political communication that we've had in recent years. And I think we need to reach persuadable voters that moved from Obama to Trump. There's no doubt about that. But one of the reasons Hillary lost is because turnout among millennials and diverse communities was soft. She didn't get to Obama's numbers, and there's been much less attention on that than there has the flip of certain segments of the white working class population. The white working class in the U.S. Has actually tended to vote Republican since Ronald Reagan. So we lost the majority of those voters a while back. We don't want percentages to slip any further, but I think we need a candidate who can both reach a good proportion of them and motivate these other parts of the electorate.
Those millennials that you speak of, I mean, obviously I was in New York. Was I? Yeah, I was. I was in Brooklyn on the night of the election, and I think we were all stunned to see that sort of that blue wall that we spoke of. I don't know if they even called it a blue wall before then, but maybe they did, just fall on election night. Are those millennials important to those battleground states of Michigan and Wisconsin, or are we looking for new voters in other areas? Someone made a point to me when I was over in the States just recently that I don't know why we're bothering going after Ohio when we lost Ohio by more votes than we lost Georgia. Georgia's a state that needs to come onto the map and a state that we need to really double down strongly as opposed to thinking about trying to pick up Ohio. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know that Ohio will be a targeted state this time around. I mean, the only Democrat to win statewide elected office there in the past several years is my old boss, Sherrod Brown. That's looking tough on the presidential map. The map may be slightly different this time around. I think that those blue wall states of Pennsylvania, of Michigan, of Wisconsin, they will remain at the top of the list. I think they are winnable. That's a combination of the folks you were talking about, the millennials in cities and suburbs, but they've also got a good proportion of blue collar voters who were open to voting for President Obama, and I think we can win them back. Part of it is because of Trump's trade war with China. Farmers and manufacturers and others that had been hardcore Trump supporters have really been hammered on that issue. But I think the map will change to take a look at, we'll see if Georgia's on it. I think at least North Carolina will be. And we're also seeing Arizona as a competitive state this time around. We always thought there'd be a year when it got competitive. It is now. I know that polling is showing at least a couple of the Democratic candidates beating President Trump in that state. If you track the spending of outside progressive groups that are going after Trump, they're starting to spend pretty heavily in Arizona, and that's always a good leading indicator of whether or not the campaign will target it.
Let's turn to the topic that you've been speaking a lot on over the last couple of days. You're probably sick to death of speaking about it, but I was going to do it one more time for our listeners that didn't get a chance to get up to Sydney. You wrote a piece in the Guardian last week, which was talking broadly about social democratic parties and the challenges that we are facing in a modern world with globalisation. You draw some really interesting comparisons between what's going on in the United States and what's going on in here in Australia off the back of the surprise 2016 election for Trump, and then obviously the surprise election in 2019 this year for where Labor didn't win, where we were hoping to, or certainly the front runners to do so, very similar to Hillary. And you outlined some of the things, you sort of talked about some of the problems that are happening right now in Australia and the United States, and then outlined for the left to win again, it must do at least three things that you've listed. I wonder if you can sort of run through those three things, and then maybe we can have a bit of a chat about each of those three things and unpack them, about how, give us examples where you think it has worked in the United States and what we need to do in the future.
Absolutely. So, the trends, I think, that have been impacting us globally and helping to lead to the rise of the far right to power, not only here and not only in the United States, but in Brazil and in Hungary and in many other countries, are globalization and automation. Some people have benefited from them, but a decent amount of people have not. And it's led to a historic rate of income inequality and perpetual economic anxiety that's leading to a shock election after a shock election. The constant feeling that we want to throw the bums out and that the population is raging against the machine. Democrats in 2016 didn't really outline a vision that addressed those core economic anxieties. Donald Trump ran on that anxiety and ran on fear and said he was the strong man who would protect you from those things. We responded with our message, which was stronger together, which the implication was Donald Trump is a divisive figure. But we took our usual list of policies from a half dozen or a dozen constituency groups and rolled out white papers on 100 different issues, and that didn't allow one message to break through. And that wasn't an effective strategy. We've made some progress in 2018 in the midterm elections. We really just ran on health care and said that Donald Trump and the Republicans are eroding your health care. They're in the process of kicking millions of people off the rolls. For others, they're eroding their existing coverage. Don't vote for them if you want a stable health care program. And that was a much more effective message. But in a presidential election, we need a proactive vision, too. So first, I think we need to be absolutely crisp about our message. It's got to be simple and repeatable. And it's got to speak to those economic anxieties that people are experiencing. We can't just say we're for free college. We have to tell people what we're educating to help them do and what jobs will be available. Not everybody's going to learn how to code. If you were working in a coal mine 5 years ago and you're 50 years old, you might not be able to go back to school to learn how to code. And so we need an inclusive vision for all Americans that tells them how we will secure their economic future, acknowledging globalization and automation as trends that are likely to continue. Secondly, I think we need to expose the populism that's coming from the right as being fraudulent. Donald Trump, and I believe Morrison too, has created, this foil that there are these elites out there that are coming for your job because they have created these trends of globalization and automation. And Trump is really leaning into immigration, too, to say that immigrants are taking your jobs away. But both of them have stacked their cabinets with people very close to the financial services industry. They're completely anti-regulation. They're completely anti-consumer. The only piece of legislation Donald Trump has passed through Congress is a corporate tax cut that actually raised taxes on many individuals. And so the notion that he is a populist or can carry that mantle is an absolute lie, and we need to expose it as a fraud. And thirdly, we need to run modern campaigns that reach people where they are and deal with some of the current communications challenges we're facing. So, of course, that means reaching people on their mobile phones in real time, creating great creative that's viral, that's shareable. But it also means dealing with things like the threats of misinformation in a new way. So when I was running presidential campaign communication shops, we had a rapid response team that would monitor what the opposition was saying, and we'd put out statements and tweets to respond to them in real time. That's not going to be enough this time around, because we're not only competing against the opposition, but we're competing against these Trump groups that are hiding within Reddit, spreading misinformation. And we've already got foreign governments like the Russians and the Iranians who have created content and tried to interfere in the U.S. election that's still a year away. And so we've got to have sophisticated social listening that takes a look at the content warfare that's out there every day. We've got to be able to respond in real time and respond through multimedia. When our opponent airs a television attack against us, we respond. And we don't repeat the attack. We respond in a compelling way. We need to do that on digital this time around. And look, if it's coming from a foreign government or somebody who shouldn't be involved in this at all, we need to contact law enforcement and the tech platforms and use our legal muster and all these other sorts of tools. So it's got to be a much more staffed up, sophisticated effort than it has been in the past.
Let's unpack some of that and go backwards. One of the conversations that dominated the conference on the weekend was Facebook. Anthony Albanese, the leader of the Labor Party, made a headline speech on the Saturday calling out Facebook and saying that there needs to be more regulation against social media platforms. Is there, what kind of world do you foresee in the future where that is going to happen? I mean, Facebook is, and all the social media platforms are these diverse multimedia, mass media organisations that have literally popped up, in the grand scheme of things in the last 20 minutes. And it's taken us all a while to sort of grapple with it and use it. And, as a campaigner, even trying to use Facebook to campaign to constituents, every election cycle, they keep on changing the rules internally within Facebook. So, 10 years ago, you could scrape the back end of Campaign Central and match it against the roll and have everyone's telephone numbers. That doesn't apply anymore because they've changed, So you're constantly trying to adapt. Is one of those major solutions regulation at a government level, nation by nation, to say to Facebook, right, this is how you are going to engage with with businesses and with constituents in a general sense? Do you foresee that actually happening? Like, is Zuckerberg listening to this sort of stuff?
I do think that the tech platforms will be regulated at some level. I think that is highly likely. The question is at what level, and the other question is what is being regulated? Is it the size of the company? Is it the content itself? And if it's the content, who should be regulating that? I mean, I think Facebook's argument is strong that they shouldn't be the arbiters for the country of what content is fair and not fair and what content is accurate and inaccurate. And they are putting, fact-checking marks next to some of the non-advertising content. But if it's not them, is it a government entity? And, in the U.S. at least, I think there'd be concern about if it's a government entity that's regulating the content, how do you ensure that it's nonpartisan? And how do you ensure that it's nonpartisan if somebody like Donald Trump is president who's politicizing the Justice Department? So, it's a complicated question. I think some level of regulation will likely be achieved, but I also don't think any of that is likely to happen before the next election. So I really think it's on the Democratic campaigns to build infrastructure that allows us to firefight in real time and deal with the reality before us today.
Do you foresee a bipartisan approach from Congress on this issue?
It's possible. I think you've seen a Democratic senator like Mark Warner work with the numbers on the right. The issue is they have different concerns. So the right's concern is over what they view as censorship. They think that if there's strict controls that the platforms implement, that voices on the right will be censored. The left is more concerned about misinformation and election interference. So, look, if the Democrats make big gains in the elections, maintain the House, and the Senate is at least very tight, there might be some bipartisan work done on this issue, but they're approaching it from completely different angles.
Then moving into the more campaign space, you said that we need to run more modern, integrated campaigns that reach voters where they consume their information. Tell me, do you think this is an accurate reflection of the strengths of the Democratic and Republican campaigns over the last, going back to the Bush-Kerry election? I remember a documentary that I have watched on a number of occasions, and often going into a campaign, I will rewatch it to remind myself about how the left can get things wrong. So Goes the Nation, which was based on the Bush-Kerry campaign, focused on Ohio. And the takeaway from that was a lot of things you spoke about before. The Bush campaign had a very simple, clear message. The Kerry campaign had a lot of messages to a lot of people. But also talked about the Republican field game, or their ground game, was quite strong compared to the Democrats. Fast forward to 2008, it seems to have flipped the other way around, and then 2012 as well. It was a reputation. It was an amazing achievement for Obama to double down in 4 years later, and to get the electorate to return him again. I think a lot of people think about the 2008 campaign as being amazing. I've always felt 2012 was the one that was actually an incredibly good, strong campaign against a really strong Republican campaign. Then to 2016, a lot of people have said that the Republicans either caught up and then passed the Democrats. Now, I did do a bit of campaigning in 2016, and a lot of friends that worked in different parts of the campaign. Do you think is that a fair reflection?
Look, I think the Democrats, had built on the 2012 playbook and had all the sophisticated tools at their disposal that the Republicans did. I think there are a couple of key differences. One is that Facebook had offered, embeds to the various campaigns that had a good understanding of the platform. The Clinton campaign said, no, we don't want somebody from the company embedded at our headquarters. And the Republicans said, yes. So there's been, there's been some reflection on that. I think too that Democrats are trying to catch up, both by building on the institutional knowledge that we have, and also making seed investments in dozens of new tech platforms that will launch prior to the next election. There was a lot of testing done in 2018 with those tools, everything from analytics to organizing. And we'll see if any of those help us succeed. There's a lot of generous Democratic donors in Silicon Valley and elsewhere that are investing in that tech. But I think the thing to really watch for is the advertising rules of the platforms are changing in real time, and how you can target voters is changing in real time. And, Twitter banned political advertising, for example. So, it's a responsibility of firms like mine to take a look at how you can still find persuadable voters and reach them with the information that will move them to vote for our candidate, and we've got to modernize all of our tools to be ready for that. I think we have, but that's the question of the cycle. And I think, in retrospect, a lot of Democrats have pushed hard for significant restrictions on political advertising digitally. But I don't think you'd have Barack Obama or AOC or some others if we didn't have those digital tools to reach people and tell them about our insurgent candidates. I think it might benefit incumbents if you start to take all of these tools away. So the companies really have to strike the right balance.
And then to the second point that you mentioned, you were talking about provide a vision on how we'll address the challenges of globalisation in a way that supports the average family. Easier said than done. Do you see some successes with that? You spoke about healthcare for the midterms, leading into the 2020 presidential and watching the way the candidates are approaching their primary campaigns. Is there someone or are there candidates that stand out that you think they are talking about? No, and I hate the whole we're having the conversation. I actually want to see, I think as if a voter, I want to see actual solutions. I don't want you to have the conversation.
Yeah.
Is there someone that you're noticing amongst the Democratic field that you're going, okay, I think they've got a good ear for the average voter?
I'd been critical of the Democratic debate over education until the past couple of weeks because it had been entirely focused on free college and what's the income bracket and means test to access free college. And I believe everybody should have a college education if they want to pursue it. The problem with that is we've been having that debate for 2-3 election cycles, and we never said, should we take a look at the curriculum? Should we give people a better sense of what good-paying jobs are going to be available for them, for their kids? What types of training alternatives are available if a 4-year college program is not right for them? Mayor Pete rolled out some substantive thoughts on the curriculum this week, what we should be training people to do. When I was a kid and we went to school, and studied social studies, we spent all of our time memorizing the state capitals. They still do that today. And I just think of sort of how irrelevant that is when we could educate people about the challenges in the world, the skills they could build to get a great job, to be a strategic thinker, and compete in the knowledge economy if they go that route. There's a ton more we could be doing. I was on the board of a school that taught underprivileged kids K through 12 how to code as just one of their, 6 to 9 classes during the day. And they had a 100% success rate of sending those kids to 4-year colleges. So we really need to be more innovative and more forward-looking. And I think we can. And I think we need to roll out a new vision for trade, too. It's sort of been pro-free trade or anti-free trade. We turned against the Trans-Pacific Partnership during the 2016 election after some political pressure from the left, but never came back and said, okay, this is a very competitive century. China really is on the rise and going country by country and trying to strike up economic relationships. So what's our progressive vision for how to deal with that? What does it mean for job creation at home? Where are exports benefiting us, and what does that policy look like? We can answer all these sorts of questions, but I think we tend to rely on the easy answers, which is, you'll be fine with just a high school education, we'll get manufacturing to come back to your town. And we've been saying that for years, and it hasn't resulted in great outcomes, and I think we have to be more innovative.
The final question before we let you go. You've spent a couple of days here now in Australia and speaking to a lot of people from the centre left, so people who work for the Australian Labor Party and the trade union movement. Anything that struck you in terms of lessons that you can take home back to the United States that you found to be useful?
Well, the first thing I noticed was we have a lot of shared challenges. I think there was a sense here in Australia that after the last election, a lot of progressive organizations thought that Labor had the election in the bag. And so, instead of figuring out how helpful they could be in delivering the election for Labor, they came with a list of 10 demands, for Labor to sign off on in the policy platform. And that didn't allow for a clear message to break through. It's clear that Morrison used his personal charisma and a multimedia effort to reach people in showing that he would be a strong leader. You had the shared challenge of a bunch of outside spending to define, shorten, and that's something we're definitely going to face against the Democratic candidate. And so I learned several things that I think will be helpful in going back home. Number one, I think there's been a lot of attention on Queensland here and how you talk to working class voters who had stable jobs before, relied on Labor before, but flipped to the coalition here this time around because they felt more economically secure with them. I think there's the sense that, my gut that we really needed this forward-looking economic vision, I think is reinforced with that lesson. I think secondly, talking to folks here, you do have strong party organizations where people feel deeply committed and involved and like they have a say in how the parties run. The Democratic Party itself is kind of a non-existent institution in the United States. We ask people to vote every 2 years, but it's really a turnout operation. So are there things we can ask Democrats to do or to get people involved in the party between elections that keeps them engaged more consistently? I think that's another thing that I'll take home.
I think that's something that you guys actually do better than us, though. In my old job as someone who was directing field organisers, we looked to some of the methods, for example, that OFA, Obama for America, or Organising for Action, were doing during your time when you were in the White House, and how you could link your legislative agenda and then try and mobilise people in communities to put pressure on congressmen and congresspeople to vote the right way. It's something that we've started to try and do, certainly here in the great state of Victoria, but we have a long way to go, and we need to get better at that. But certainly one of the biggest takeaways that I've had in my time working in the Labor movement is whenever I've travelled around the globe and met with other people from social democratic parties, everyone has great ideas. And we need to get together more often. That best practice sharing thing is such a powerful weapon for all of us on the left.
I think that's right. For the first time in my life after Trump was elected, people on the left around the world were just reaching out to me through Facebook to say, hey, we had a surprise loss, or things feel like they're drifting right. Can we talk more? Can we share lessons? There's really no one forum for that. But I completely agree that we could learn so much from each other. And, on issues like climate and other things, it's not that we shouldn't just organize around that issue itself, but share our best tactics for how to run these modern winning campaigns.
We have a long way to go. We wish you the best of luck next year going into the presidential election. And thanks very much for your time coming on the podcast to talk to us today.
Thanks for having me.